We've seen the release of the Zero Carbon Act today, so this is great news for New Zealand, and with its focus on adaptation, this panel is incredibly relevant. But then regardless of how quickly we reduce our carbon emissions, some climate change is already locked in, so we do need that adaptation. Hence, research to understand climate impacts and support well-planned, timely and cost-effective adaptation is crucial. We're very proud of the research underway in the Deep South Challenge, which ranges from climate impact studies to research around the ethics of sea level rise policy or the risk of insurance retreat due to increased climate risks. We're also excited to have Lincoln University economist Anita Rayford join our science leadership team, and you've just heard from her. Welcome, Anita. We hope this panel teases out some of the core challenges of adaptation and stretches somewhat into the future to help us understand the signals and triggers that might cause New Zealand to pick up the pace of climate adaptation. We're lucky to have Chief Editor of Stuff, Patrick Crewdson, chairing the panel today, and trust he'll steer the conversation in interesting directions. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks, Mike. That sounds like a challenge for this panel to be at least as interesting and informative as the previous ones, and ideally, twice or so. Thank you. So this panel is designed to cover, talking about from insurance, community and legal pressure to ethics, politics and insurance, what will really make us start adapting to climate change. I find it a particularly interesting topic because it's less about the forecasting or the mitigating of climate change and more about how we handle it, how we adapt, and what the triggers are that will force or persuade individuals and communities and companies and industries and sectors and even politicians to adapt. So this is a conversation, I think, about where the rubber meets the road and how to actually achieve action. I'll introduce the distinguished panellists in just a second, but first I want to give them advance warning of what my first question is going to be. And it's pretty much a double cliche. I'm going to start with a quote, which is cliched by itself, and it's a quote from Greta Thunberg, the teenage climate change activist, which is probably the most cliched person I could have chosen to quote. So it's a double cliche, but she has said recently, the one thing we need more than hope is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So while I introduce you, if you could prepare, after I introduce each of you, you can tell us the one adaptation action that you think, for climate change, that you think we need more than any other. So starting from my left and your left here, Huhana Smith, from Whiti Aotearoa School of Art at Massey University. Huhana is a visual artist, curator and researcher who engages in major environmental, transdisciplinary, kaupapa Māori and action research projects. She is leading the Deep South Challenge project Risk Management for Māori Coastal Assets, which had a previous related project, Climate Change in Coastal Māori Communities. And her research draws on Mātauranga Māori and Western science to devise climate solutions for coastal Māori lands in Horowhenua and Kapiti. And in her complex environmental projects, innovative research techniques lead to extraordinary outcomes, particularly exhibitions, which we'll return to with a question a little bit later on. But how would you react to Greta?
Beg your pardon?
How would you react to Greta Thunberg?
To that question? Yeah, it's all about action. It's you might find hope in maybe some of the exhibitions that we've done, but we are very action orientated in the rohe between the Oho and the Waikawa rivers, where our hapu have been acting up since mid-1990s, restoring wetlands, sorting out waterway problems, because we could see and feel the problems there. So when it comes to the added vulnerabilities of climate change, it's all about action. It's just koe korero. Noiho, you don't just only talk, you act. So that's what we've been doing, but I'll talk a bit more about that later. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panellist is Janet Stevenson from the Centre of Sustainability at the University of Otago. And Janet leads the Deep South Challenge project, Climate Adaptation, Vulnerability and Community Wellbeing. She's the director, as I said, of the Centre for Sustainability, which is an interdisciplinary research centre at Otago, and her research interests include Indigenous resource management, the interconnections between people and their local environments, and the role of individuals and organisations in the transition to a sustainable future. So, Janet, what's one adaptation action you would prioritise above all others?
Based on the work that we've been doing over the last year and a half, particularly with two communities, but one community in particular, which we were talking about yesterday, which is the South Dunedin community, an area which is very challenged already by sea level rise and increased flooding. I would say that the one action that is critically important is to create the opportunity and the resourcing to enable a community itself to come together to start to talk about what does this mean for us, and to start to, on the basis of that, say, this is who we are, this is how we will build our resilience, and this is how we will start envisaging the changes that we need. I think we're at such an early stage in the transition process for adaptation. We can't say we need to build seawalls or we need to plant trees or whatever, but those conversations to create those linkages between people are absolutely essential as the first step.
Thank you, Janet. Next up, we have John Morrow from Auckland Council, and John is the Council's first Chief Sustainability Officer. His focus is on unlocking the potential of Auckland's low-carbon transformation, building climate resilience, and leading by example through business and operational practices. John has come to Auckland from Seattle, and he has more than 20 years' experience in climate policy and research and advocacy. I'll give him a second to finish pouring water, and then John...
It's all about water, I suppose.
What would your number one action be?
Kia ora koutou. It's a great question. Look, not to build too much off of just what Janet said, but it's actually quite poignant. Maybe two things. One, action is built into the work we're doing. Nothing like a bureaucrat getting up and saying, hey, we've got action in mind, but we're creating, in fact, with many of those in this room, including the emergency management team, including the research team, including the Chief Sustainability Office, and probably others I'm missing, an integrated climate action plan for Auckland. And if you haven't heard about that yet, please, and you, especially if you live here, please get in touch because we need your help to develop it and get it over the line. More close to the question, I'd say that building both community capacity and actually, let's go existential because it's the end of the day and this is the last thing, right? We need a fundamental shift in how our democratic system can adapt to change. Right now, people are disenfranchised, people don't have a voice that counts, people aren't here representing their communities, they don't have the tools and the information they need, or the voice or the power to do that. So I think reinventing our democratic structure, easy one, right, is really at the core of what we need to think about.
I think we'll come back to that.
Great.
Lisa McLaren from Generation Zero, who have probably patting themselves on the back justifiably today. Pretty good day given the Zero Carbon Bill. So Lisa's the national convener of the Zero Carbon Act campaign. She became involved in climate change activism about 8 years ago and has been a youth delegate to UN climate talks in multiple cities. She's currently undertaking a PhD at the Joint Centre for Disaster Research at Massey, and her research looks at how citizen-led science can be used as a tool for coastal community groups to adapt. Lisa, your number one action.
Well, you just stole my one. So, but I really liked what you said about the politicians adapting, and I think today, with our Zero Carbon Act finally reaching Parliament after 3 years of designing and campaigning, that's probably quite a good one. But I would say look around the room and see who you've got in the space, who are you talking to, and who is missing. There are a lot of people missing in this room. Youth is one group. There's also structurally oppressed communities and others, but I guess speaking it from the youth perspective is these people have a lot to offer, and it's not just to be consulted with or engaged with. It's these people have skills, these youth have skills, and I'm blown away every time I get to to meet with, especially the school strikes crew and the younger ones coming through. They're amazing and they're passionate and they are very knowledgeable in the stuff. So use that. It's capacity. It's people that can champion your work and get them here.
Thank you, Lisa. Rob Bell from NIWA. Rob is NIWA's principal scientist for coastal and, I knew in advance I was going to mispronounce this, but estuarine physical processes. Close enough. And also a researcher on the Deep South Challenge Project, National Flood Risks and Climate Change. Rob was a lead author of the 2017 Coastal Hazards and Climate Change Guidance for Local Government, which the Ministry for the Environment published, and was a contributing author on the recent implementation guidance on coastal hazard policies in the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. And his areas of work and interest include coastal engineering, coastal oceanography, natural hazards, risk assessment, water quality, and climate change impacts and adaptation, which is very appropriate. So Rob, your number one action.
Kia ora tātou. I've got action 1A and B. And we've seen, particularly as I work a lot with councils, work with infrastructure projects, we've got to put the brakes on land use planning around coastal areas in particular. Coastal impacts, I mean, I work in the coast, that's our biggest threat. We've got to put the brakes on somehow, and so as you roll and scroll through all these stuff articles, I mean, there was one this week or last week around Mānuka, redeveloping a campsite. They've got zillions of conditions on it, but most of the coastal experts would probably tell you it's going to last 10 or 20 years. The second one is, and working with Judy around the adaptive dynamic pathways, is how we implement that in the land use and resource management planning. How do we bed down an adaptive system that is designed with a very static sort of view of the world?
Thanks, Rob. And our final panellist is Tim Grafton, the Chief Executive of the Insurance Council of New Zealand. And Tim is also the chair of the Deep South Challenge's representative user group, which has the delightful acronym of the RUG. He speaks and writes regularly about the implications of climate change for insurance in New Zealand and has a strong understanding of the machinery of government and an extensive knowledge of post-disaster recovery issues and insurance regulation. Tim, what would your number one action be?
Well, kia ora tātou, and thank you very much for inviting an insurance voice on this panel. Adaptation is about risk reduction. You can't start reducing risk unless you understand that risk. So I think the best thing we could do collectively as a nation is have every single property in New Zealand have its natural hazard risks identified, so that every property owner, every banker, every insurer, every local government, every body can make informed decisions about risk and start reducing it.
Should we have a round of applause for all of the panellists? Thank you for introduction. Thank you. Thank you. So, panellists, I think you're here for the full contents of your brains, including your opinions. But we will particularly want to speak about or hear about your experience, and would welcome you citing concrete examples from your work as you speak. We'll start off with a reasonably general question for the panel at large, which is, communities are starting to react to climate change in different ways. In your work, have you seen any patterns in the triggers that are prompting action? And we can either run down the line or you can just leap in as you feel like it.
Yeah, I think a number of councils are down the track, but what I see is a number of, particularly as we put out guidance, for instance, a number of councils and infrastructure operators and other sectors are looking for entry points. You know, this is a big topic. It's about change. How do we start the process? Where do we start? So it's a kind of like a stunned headlight sort of syndrome. I think we're in that sort of phase. So it's enabling people to make those first steps, to start engaging with their communities, start looking at risk assessments, all these things. So I think we're in this phase where we need to encourage people in pathways that they can actually make a difference.
If I could jump in and just firstly I forgot to say tēnā rā koutou katoa ki te iwi kāinga Ngāti Whātua o rākei ki tamaki makaurau kana witimihi atu ki a koutou. The really kind of critical thing and what Rob's talking about as well is communities being able to get engaged in climate change. I know from our experience with iwi and hapu, and I've got our research team is down here. Aroha spoke, I think it was Monday. Aroha spoke in the panel just before, Aroha and Moira. Hopefully showed you pictures of Southwest Coast, Hoda Phenoix, North Island. That's the area we've been working in for many years, probably a good 23 years now. And I mean, initially we started off with the whole notions of concerns about the economies of our farming and how long is this going to last when we could see that there was trouble with the water quality, and even though we had a very successful tribal farm and not just one hapu, we had 2 hapu farms going on the coast at Hoda Phenoix. What we experienced from our people in our 30s to we're now in our 50s, but when we started in our 30s, we noticed that there was problems in regards to the water quality that was having an impact on the community. So there's a dysfunction that comes out of, even though we have a strong economic base, which is farming, it's actually leading to the decline of waterway quality. So by engaging in really comprehensive, good research with other specialists coming into that Māori space to alleviate some of those laments that our kaumatua were talking about, the loss of species, the loss of whitebait, the loss of healthy tuna stocks, all these kind of things, is the kind of research that gets a community going and gets a community engaged, because Māori are not able to live their sustainable lives or their ability to kind of eat safely. So if you're talking about a community to be engaged, you're talking about working with communities who know their place and they know their place within it, but they also know that other systems have impacted and created a change to that place. So if you work in community research, is what we have done, water quality research is only another part of climate change research. So from what we did as developing our community capacity as hapu, is that we also had to not only sort water quality issues out in multiple spaces within our tribal farms, but we on coastlines in southwest Hoda Whenua. And if people can see themselves between Levin and Otaki, that's the coastline we were talking about. But it's that kind of community-based research with people who know their place within it, know local fishing, have local knowledge of place, have kōrero tuku iho, have Māori ancestral relationships to place. That is the community that is rich in order to bring other minds and sensibilities in, other knowledge systems in, and then that has become the basis of, I do believe, with shameless saying, but I do believe that's what's made our climate change research successful, because we had a community of active hapu participants who wanted to see change the way it used to be in their childhood, or the way it used to be with their grandparents, or the way it used to be with their parents.
And so for the people in those communities, it wasn't just seeing, in terms of them getting engaged in that research and starting to act, it wasn't just them seeing their livelihoods or their lifestyles under threat, it was thinking back to the way things used to be? The way things used to be, but in a Māori worldview, the past, the present, the future is all happening at once. So for those people, it was more the visceral, the agony that they were feeling about the changes in their natural environment was actually causing a sense of dysfunction or a sense of disease. So when we started doing our research, it was all about trying to re-enable the healing of water, and then in that kind of tangential way re-heal a community. And it's not unlike with the South Dunedin community being actively involved in the solutions for their community, because they've been there for generations. They have a long-term knowledge view that should be feeding into those projects of problems that are happening in their faces now. And I think, just telling you a lot in a short space, but is that the success of community-led research projects is because people see themselves in that project. They see their whole whānau,
They see their intergenerational relationships in that research, and they're able to use that knowledge to promulgate better futures. But you have to do it with all the other knowledge, so the climate change science, the geomorphology, the flooding, the et cetera, which is what these people do. I mean, we all work in wide teams of people.
Janet, and while you're answering, sorry, I might just say that the flip side of this might be a good time to consider that as well, not just what's getting people to act, but also what's putting on the brakes, what's stopping people from acting.
I was going to, from our research, I think I can describe probably 4 different kinds of trigger points for action. And one is what I'd call the kind of property protection trigger, which is where people have maybe got a house and it's near the sea and the sea's eroding and they want to protect it, so they want a seawall. So that's kind of an individualistic response that we're seeing that may be multiplied if there's several buildings or places. Another kind of category of response is actually amongst existing organisations that may be focused on resilience, focused on the future, focused on sustainability, like transition town groups that have quite a scope of interest in how do we respond to these challenges ahead, and are opening that up into how do we adapt as well. And so there's quite a lot of activity in that area. There's also the trigger where there are kind of creeping impacts, like in South Dunedin, where people tell stories that they used to be able to go out and get their washing with their slippers on, and now they have to wear their gumboots. They go out and dig their garden, and there's water this far below the surface now. Those are real visceral responses that are really telling people something very important. There's also the trigger of a major event, and certainly this is what we've seen in Dunedin, this is what we've seen in the Blueskin Resilient Communities Trust area, and we're starting to see in other areas where there's a big, for example, a flood event, and that really lifts the understanding of the entire community that they are at risk and that this may happen more frequently. And in fact, in South Dunedin, it has happened several times since then. And so I guess those are the kind of things that I think are telling people in a visceral way how climate change may impact them. But I think the barriers to action are often two. I think one barrier is where people are much more about self-protection than they are thinking about the wider community and future generations. So it's the inward-looking versus the outward-looking, and I think the inward-looking perspective is one that can be very constraining for real action. I think the other big barrier is the systemic barrier, the fact that for any individual in South Dunedin, their ability to make a difference is really constrained. For any landowner, for anybody in a rental property, their ability to do something is constrained by the systems around them. So it's not until, as John said, those wider systems start shifting to enable action that they're going to be able to be freed up to take action.
John or Lisa?
Yeah, I guess so. To go back to what patterns there might be, and some of the barriers. I think on patterns, it's sort of like there's just a bunch of people in a room moving different directions. They're either freaking out because we're probably these people, let's just be clear. We know what's about to go on, we need to figure out a way to fix it, and we all have different ideas. Some people are probably just partying like it's 1999, they have no idea what's going on, they're just having fun. But I think there's kind of this big sort of stochastic soup of like going all different directions. And I think kind of to what Janet was saying, that started to kind of coalesce in a direction. And I won't say, I mean, obviously today we could see with the, I'm going to try to get this right, the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Bill. Did I get that? I think I got that, thank you. Which I haven't read, but I will read. That, a framework is necessary to kind of convene, all the actors, set a direction, set expectation. And I would say that, luckily the wind's already shifted. We've got communities that are working together to common purposes, setting aside some of the individualistic differences and really thinking about kind of long-term here intergenerational issues. And I think actually some of this is leapfrogging. So we've gone from, like literally today, as we were sitting in this room, we went from business, this sounds a little bit hokey, but business leading the charge because we've got a climate leaders coalition, and we're a member, I'll admit that. They were leading the charge further than government, further than the public sector. They were saying, we're going to take on climate change in a very serious way. Today that shifted. Today, their 2% target that they were saying we need to comply to at least on the emissions side, deal with our Paris obligations and deal with climate change. Although there's a notable lack of climate resilience in that agreement, and we should talk about that later. But then it just flipped today, like literally today. Now government's leading the charge with a more ambitious target, with a clear path toward a climate change risk assessment for New Zealand, for a national adaptation plan, for knowledge-seeking powers by the minister. I mean, like game on, central government. Okay, now they're shifting. So the pattern I see is this sort of leapfrog action, and of course there's Auckland Council in there somewhere. We're trying to lead something. We had probably the first regional 1.5 compliant target set by our councillors unanimously a couple months ago. So what I really like about this is that these players, from kind of going from this either party kind of meme to freaking out and running different directions with different ideas, we're now with a common purpose, a common aim, actually trying to leapfrog and outdo each other, which is so human nature. It's so useful that we're trying to outcompete each other. So that's just my reflection on patterns. On barriers, I feel like we could list a ton of them. Some of them are very systemic, like Janet was saying, and we need to address those things. Some would say, hopefully, that climate change and inequality, maybe we'll get to this, are very linked. And in fact, those are probably, from my opinion, the two most important issues of our time, or maybe all time, to deal with. But I think barriers are also perceived barriers. And I'm going to take a bit of a dagger at maybe, your competition, at your fine outlet, and say, we don't report really well on the truth. There's agendas and there's kind of continuity of business as usual being propagated through media, being propagated through messaging, where everyone else has probably moved on. We've changed quite a bit and how we see climate change and the need to adapt. And we're held back by the same common narrative that's clickbait on New Zealand Herald or wherever it might be, where it's just like, okay, it's firing people up and firing up division, not reporting consistently, hat tip to stuff, on climate change and what this means for our nation. That's a serious hindrance. Not having a formal framework until today, it will happen from now, was a serious hindrance. Not having some information, which is why a lot of you are in this room, was a serious hindrance. But I don't think that it's an excuse, because I think business as usual likes to hide in the kind of shady corners and use ambiguity to its advantage and say, well, we don't know enough yet. We don't have enough information. We don't have consensus. That's BAU is sort of BS, right? That's actually just an excuse to not take action. So we need to kind of all make a commitment personally to skewer that business as usual and say, that's not acceptable. We might never know enough to know precisely what's going to happen on a square piece of land with rising sea levels, for instance. But we definitely know enough to act, and that's probably as much as we need to know to get going.
You are allowed to criticise stuff if you'd like, by the way.
I'm just getting warmed up.
They didn't give me the ability to cut off your microphone, so
it was more of kind of like this very gentle, implicit placing of responsibility on you to lead us forward. I hope that's okay.
Thank you. Lisa, your views on triggers or barriers?
I think, a lot of it's been covered, what I talked around trust and power dynamics within communities, and the business as usual stuff is really important. And I guess that applies to the mitigation side as well as adaptation side within this new draft legislation. So if the Zero Carbon Act, or how we presented it, is just meant to be an overarching framework that means that governments have to do stuff, and all governments, regardless on what side of the political spectrum. The problem is that the plans are where the rubber hits the road, and I'm quite concerned still about what will actually go into those plans in the future. And I think those plans could end up being a barrier if they are done not well. If the right people aren't involved in creating them, and if the right policies aren't implemented or rolled back. There's a ton of stuff in government that needs to be rolled back, both at local and central government level, that we're now starting to work on. But if those things aren't happened, then the plans could lead to nothing, and then we'll just have lawsuits for the next 30 years as we miss targets. So we have a great starting point, but I'm concerned what it could lead to.
Rob?
Yeah, I think the phrase climate change, we get very familiar with it, it's bandied around, but when you unpick it, change, what does that mean? And I detect in my conversations with people that they think it's just a perturbation on business as usual. And so a lot of my discussions with people is sort of taking them through that this is, particularly in the coastal area, it's going to be a radical shift from business as usual. So as an engineer, I enjoy working within project teams, so we were involved in jacking up the northwest, the causeway at Waterview for the northwest motorway. But again, working with those engineers, and Kathy mentioned it this morning, there's this stationarity, static approach in all the standard engineering design. So taking them through conversations around things are changing, not only in the short term, but in the long term for coasts. Sea level rise is going to continue for several centuries. There's no glass ceiling at 2100, by the way. And I really enjoyed working with Ngāi Tahu in that project that was mentioned earlier today, where they said, can you tell us what the sea level rise will be for the next several centuries? A breath of fresh air. Because I think we're subject to short-termism, and so climate change is just relegated to the next 20 years, so we'll plug it with a seawall. But actually what's going to happen is that's maladaptation. What are we going to do in the long term? What's the tracking? And how do we monitor it? So change means you have to monitor it. So I think we really need to get in our heads too, particularly with the pathways approach and other things, the effectiveness of adaptation. It's changing, so we have to monitor it so we know whether we're successful or not.
I think in our experience, the single biggest trigger is the concern that there would not be insurance for properties that are close to the sea, on the edge of a cliff, or located in a floodplain, or that the premiums will increase, or the banks won't loan, or if the banks will loan, it'll be for a short term, and if it's for a short term, it'll be for a limited capital, which will eradicate the value of your house, and that gets people agitated. And that scenario is very real. And it is why we bang on about risk reduction. What I've been really impressed about just being here today for the last couple of days is the very strong cultural and community voice that I've heard in the previous two panels. And that, I think, is a signal that when it comes to dealing with communities, you need to be having an engagement not just around the economic impacts, but you need to be looking at the cultural, the environmental, the social, and the human capitals. We are seeing a government that's decided to introduce a wellbeing budget, which will be providing some measures at that, and it'll be very much on trainer wheels. But unless we get that holistic set of capitals considered to engage all parts of the community, then we are not going to move forward. And it's not just about the loss of the house or the loss of insurance. The bankers will be there with a stronger signal a lot sooner, I can tell you. So.
Can I just add to what Tim just said? Just say it's really refreshing, not only just to hear the insurance industry leading the way here, but to also think about multiple outcomes. And I think that's one of the things that I know as our team is quite committed to is how do we deliver climate action that's both reducing emissions, preparing for climate impacts that are inevitable, but generating social, cultural, environmental, and economic outcomes as we do that. It's not a really easy set of kind of, obvious actions. It requires some hard work. But can I just see a set of hands of people who live in Auckland, just here? So I really hope that every single one of those people with a hand up connects into this and actually drives what Tim just said. We want every one of those actions to deliver those multiple benefits.
For the next question, we'll go with one for everybody except Rob. Sorry, Rob. Because this one is about MFE establishing the expert panel to create a framework for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. And the panel includes Rob, which is why he's included from the question, because this is the chance for the rest of you to get in Rob's ear about what should be in that framework when the panel is due to report next month. I think, is it Rob?
Sometime.
Yeah, better get on that. So the assessment, I think, is designed to look at future risks and how the country needs to adapt and to identify gaps in knowledge, which ties into a question that's come through from the audience actually about what is the research that's needed to enable better adaptation. So my question for all the panellists except Rob is, the framework that Rob is helping to develop for the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, what must that assessment cover? What does it really have to look at when it comes to your research and your experience? Maybe this time let's start down Tim's end.
Well, we are property and casualty insurers, so it must include the risk around property, definitely. But obviously this is a holistic national challenge that you've been set to deliver a sort of a heat map of prioritisation probably sometime next year. And so the task is huge. So there's about 10 other things I could say must be in it, but I'll just stick to that, and I'm sure others will be able to chip in with some thoughts too.
I guess first and foremost, te tiriti o tangi and engagement with iwi hapu, how that's put in there and where should be top priority, and also engaging with the youth Indigenous climate groups like Te Arawhatu and others like the Pacific Climate Warriors, what they would like to see in there, I think is really important. But also, if you're designing frameworks that's going to basically redesign Aotearoa New Zealand, having the youth voice in there about what that world actually would look like to them is quite different. Like things like roads for just individual car driving might not necessarily need to be a thing, because all the young climate activists I know don't actually have a driver's license. So these things, like I can't say our generation anymore because I'm aging out, but the younger generation, I'm youth adjacent now. They are living differently. They have different ambitions for what this country looks like and how it works. So having their views delivered directly into that framework, I think, is essential, and not in a tokenistic way.
I'm youth adjacent, just physically. Sorry. So look, I just want to draw a little bit, so classically like, oh, this is all the great stuff council's doing. We're actually doing some really great stuff. And I think there's a little bit in what we're currently doing at a local level that we can transmit to a more national context. And so hopefully folks in this room have heard both of the work that we commissioned NIWA to do, thank you NIWA, to look at the localized downscale projections to Auckland of what climate change looks like over the next 100 years, so out to 2110, I believe, so 90 years. And built on the back of that, our research and evaluation team has produced 6 climate change risk assessment reports. So those things actually look specifically at, they develop a heat index and see, oh, actually across Auckland down to a pretty localized scale, we can get a sense of what communities, what locations are going to be more vulnerable and have less adaptive capacity to things like heat stress. Same thing in the social dimension space and a whole range of other issues, the natural environment. You should look at knowledgeauckland.org to actually check these out, because they are groundbreaking. The first that we've done this at a localized scale anywhere in New Zealand, and I'm very proud of the research team who did that. And of course, there's more coming out in a matter of months, so there'll be more stuff to report about, perhaps. Clearly, as a first salvo, there are gaps, and so I would say our minds quickly go to, great, we know from a social and maybe an environmental perspective what's going to happen, where our risks and vulnerabilities are. What about the trickier stuff around economic risks, access to opportunities, less the physical and the social? Just to reiterate some of the points that have already been made, I mean, do we have an understanding of how it's going to affect land like Marae and Urupa and places that actually have significant cultural value interests to our iwi here. That's an awesome opportunity, and it needs to be part of the framework. And then just to reiterate the youth section too, I mean, that's actually a big part of the plan and the way we're trying to develop our action plan with Rangatahi, Maori, and Pacifica in particular. And of course, we've worked with Gen Zero as well. You were part of our climate symposium last month. How do we actually provide that voice in the actual structure of our plan? We don't have a direct answer yet, but we are committed to finding a way to make that happen so that the youth voice isn't a tokenistic one, but it's actually embodied in the actions and the work we do. Next.
Right. I'd like to talk about 3 different kinds of risk. And the first is the risk of, and that is the risk of our business as usual decision-making processes continuing to ensure that we invest in things that are going to be problems in the future. And just a little example of that is the Dunedin new hospital rebuild, which is being designed for an area that is probably maybe a couple of metres above sea level. I don't know really, but it's on reclaimed land. And that is a massive financial investment of billions of dollars into something that probably won't be viable for a very long time. And apparently they're designing it so that the car parks underneath can get full of water, but that doesn't sound very viable to me. So that's just an example of the risk for our future of continuing business as usual short-term decision making. The second is the risk for, and that is the risk for equity of how we're going about things. And again, maybe a couple of concrete examples here. In South Dunedin, anecdotally, house prices are depressed for obvious reasons. Because they're depressed, young families are able to buy those houses. Young families with young children are moving into houses that are damp and are subject to flooding. There are also houses, many houses that are rented. As those landlords have higher insurance premiums, are paying more, they're going to be less incentivised to be investing in those homes to keep them up to standard. Who's going to move into them? Poor people whose health will be implicated. Just 2 examples of equity implications of these impacts. And the third is the risks too. And here I'm thinking we need to not only think about the risks to the people in areas that are exposed to sea level rise and flooding, but also the networks of people whose lives are linked in some way to those places. And they may be linked through cultural associations and long-term engagement. They may be linked because they may be one of the 10 schools in South Dunedin which draw from a wide community of children right across the entire city. Is the education department thinking about what to do in future? Probably not. So how can we think more widely about risk, not just of the people in the place, but the people who will be implicated more generally?
Cool. I'd like to offer Rob just some of the outcomes that we're coming up with. We're just in the final stages of the risk assessment project, so we were funded by Deep South. And we've got some great transition action plans. So we are big on visuals because our whānau and our hapu have been working with landscape architects since 2011. And so working with like artists who are ecologists, working with spatial designers, working with architects, interior architects. We've been working with artists, and we've been working with our iwi and hapu and our governance boards on tribal farms. So I'd like to offer Rob opportunities for kind of case studies or areas of interest would actually show how iwi and hapu have been leading the transition action plans that they would like to see on their whenua. So our coastline between the Oho and the Waikawa River that we've focused on is subject to storm surge, groundwater inundation, flooding, because it's a floodplain, it's meant to flood. We've been daring there for 40 years and it's kind of successfully indebted us 2 points now that are not so good for iwi futures, but I'd like to be able to offer the visual systems that we've provided that are based on local knowledge of place. You know, they're based on cultural and social kind of concerns. They're based on ecological, environmental. They're based on ecological economics. You know, I just love to offer the risk assessment work, like a summary of the risk assessment work that we did with landscape architects, and then these transition action plans where our whānau, and I've got our queer and our tārewa here today to support us from the neighbouring farm of Ransfield, Incorporation of Ransfields, and I've been working with Tāmata Incorporation, as have Aroha and Moira, but we're going to offer you those visuals because I think we need to be showing people much more how iwi and hapu have led projects. Based on all of that information that we've gathered since 2010 and how we've extrapolated that and turned it into visuals that they've been engaged in, and then we're able to show and disseminate that complexity to others, because I think it's just critical that accelerating people's ability to get active is now more than vital. Yeah. So happy to do that for you. Yep.
Maybe if I can make a few comments about where we're at. So the whole framework, and Sean Awatiri, who you saw on the panel before, and Dee are working on. So we're going to weave Māori, te ao Māori principles through the whole framework. And also Wendy Saunders is here as well, working together so it's underpinned by engagement processes. So how we interrogate, not from a national level, but right down to the networks where risk is considered. And really looking at leadership from those. We don't call them risk owners, we call them risk custodians. So they're the ones that can make a difference. So we are working on those kind of frameworks, and taking Kathy's point this morning from her keynote address around engagement and those principles and values being fundamental rather than necessarily focusing on the risk numbers that come out the other end.
No pressure.
Before we leave risk, I'll take another question from the audience, and this is one to put you on the spot, Tim. It's from Chris, and he or she asks, ultimately the insurance industry will benefit from better hazard information. So what contributions is the industry making to enable that better hazard information to be gathered?
Well, my answer to the first question you asked was to have a database of natural hazard risk for every property in the country. So we have led facilitation at early stage with the science community, central government agencies, so that we can look at, first of all, is that a feasible idea? And we believe it is. We'd like to have a bespoke New Zealand model of risk. We think that's feasible too. What we wanted to engage in now is identifying through a gap analysis of what is the science telling us and what we don't know that we need to know to help inform such a database. And from there, not wait until we've got nirvana, but start the journey with whatever data we have now to start to try and create something like that, so that over time, as more science comes through and informs the data, becomes a lot richer. From an insurance perspective, having greater certainty around risk means that you avoid the blanket approach that you must take around the greater uncertainty that you have in pricing that risk. So if you have it at a more granular level, yes, certainly there will be some properties that will have an impact, but there will be others that won't, that might otherwise have had an impact. So it helps inform the identification of the risk at a more granular level. As the science becomes better, and I'm not being critical of the science, I'm just saying, greater computational capability, a greater scenario testing and modelling for future probability impacts, then that is going to help us and help everybody, from the planners at local government level, from the property owners and the decisions they make, from central government and its crown risk resultant liability, to the engineers, designers and builders, all of them getting informed so that we can collectively, as a nation, do a lot better. So that's the piece of work that we're contributing.
Can I add a little bit in there as well? So through our Riskgate program, had an enormous struggle about what is our inventory of assets in New Zealand, buildings, stock banks, you name it, everything. So there is no national one-stop shop custodian of our assets, and yet that's the number one risk is our assets and the things we value, and the same goes for the environment as well. So that's one thing. The second thing is around particularly attributes of some of those assets. So our number one weather-related hazard is floods. But do we know the floor levels of our buildings in South Dunedin? Probably we know a bit more now. But do we know our floor levels? No. So we've had to make up some numbers around the age of the building. So we need to get at a national level, if we're going to be serious about risk and what's exposed, to get a decent inventory at a national level.
And John and Huhana both want to jump in here. So
yeah, sure.
John.
No, I just wanted to kind of bring the here and now to what was announced today and just say, I wonder how, and maybe back to my first point about better democratic engagement. So it's a bit of a challenge to everybody in this room who has the power to submit their opinions, whether they're organization or individual, to government on the bill that has a long name. But that actually, it's interesting to me to note that actually has powers by the minister to gather information from Crown agencies, utilities, lifelines, and local governments on risk, and I think that's a wise thing. But it really limits that power to the minister. Very political. I haven't had more than any time than you have to actually look at the bill and understand what it means, but I'd be curious both what some of the panelists think about that, but actually what some of us are going to do about that. Because I would say that maybe we need a stronger, firmer, less voluntary disclosure of that information from some of the critical things that keep our society functioning. I think it's a bit soft, is what I'm trying to say.
Huhana, did you want to speak on that last point?
On the last point, I haven't. What I've only done is read the EDS response to the climate change thing that came out today. So I haven't actually read the wider, but certainly will. I mean, it's great to see, but I'm also kind of like, I think we started working on this a long time ago because we were freaking out about it 25 years ago. Well, I was. I don't know about anyone. I was freaking out about climate change.
We were just partying the other side.
Yeah. So I was part of that group, but then it was more about what can we do actively, and then what can we do to bring our iwi and hapu, in line with climate change. When I can think about just some of my aunties maybe 10 years ago are going, that's nothing. It's nothing, and now they're right behind us. So aunties and uncles are right behind us.
Well, let's talk more about the bill then. Lisa, you, thank you. We published an opinion column from you on Stuff this morning.
Thank you.
In that, you described this bill as being a huge first step, but not ideal. So when it comes to adaptation in particular and spurring adaptation, how would you rate it there?
Adaptation has been sort of an afterthought the whole way through, both our campaign and I think the wider engagement within the bill process. And that's not intentional, it's just where our sort of group was coming from. We do a lot more with mitigation work than adaptation. And I think, as I said, it is a good first step, but I think there are ways it could be made a lot stronger, and I would encourage everyone to submit during Select Committee on this, but also tell us what you think sooner, because we'll be writing our own submission, and although we're a bunch of youth, we actually tend to have a bit of perceived power in the space now. So interested to hear thoughts on that. But to be honest, we were tossing up whether adaptation would be in this bill at all when we first drafted it a couple of years ago, and had a lot of conversations, some with people in this room, about whether it should have its own piece of legislation or not, and it was a political call, I guess, we just want to get this bill through, and we thought that if we left adaptation out, it might never get its own thing. So I guess it's up to us now to make it as strong as possible with what we're working with.
Janet, you've previously written about the need for law to be fit for purpose for climate change. Is this, accepting that you probably haven't had a chance to read the whole thing yet, how fit for purpose do you think this bill looks?
I've only read a very brief headline about it so far today, but I'd just like to pick up on what Lisa was saying just now, and I too vacillated about whether the Climate Change Act should actually have mitigation and adaptation together, and I've come down on the side of thinking that it does make sense for them to both be in there, largely because they are both situations in which we need huge structural changes and huge on-the-ground changes, and those have to happen together and in concert. And if we don't achieve that, then there's going to be a lot of fighting against each other. So hopefully this bill is structured in a way that those kinds of fundamental transitional changes are carried ahead in the same handful. And I must say that I'm really inspired, particularly by iwi such as Ngāi Tahu, who are looking at what they call climate response, which is actually bringing both those things together in the same vision and say, how can we reduce our emissions and adapt at the same time?
Yeah, it's really at the core of what we're trying to do locally in Auckland. And I mean, we could all imagine a scenario where we do our best to reduce emissions, and that completely leaves us vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. You know, so great, everyone's kind of walking around in really flood-prone areas, all connected with great commerce right on the coastline, and everyone loves it. And then suddenly we're all underwater. Likewise, we could be creating this great adapted community where we're putting lots of embedded carbon into the solutions and protecting ourselves. We kind of can't do either of those things. We need to do them both together. So just to give you an amen on that.
And again, I've only scanned the bill, but I think it's not clear what national conversations we're going to have about the funding models for adaptation. So having been involved in the Hawke's Bay Coastal Strategy as co-production, engaging with communities, the hard question there is about implementation of those pathways. So it's a mix of targeted rates, general rates, TLAs and regional councils putting in money, and then cap in hand to a government. So we need to get that sorted out, and hopefully it provides some vehicle, although unclear at the moment, about how we have national conversations about the funding model for adaptation without creating moral harm as well for people who knowingly build or develop in strange places.
Let's go down to Tim and then quickly back to Janet.
I take the view that adaptation is more important, and I take it, I'm absolutely committed to our mitigation targets, but why it's more important, and I stand corrected by any scientist in the room, but my understanding from the most recent ICPP projections is that we are not going to achieve 1.5 degrees. We are not at the moment on target for 2 degrees. We are heading for 3.1. And I tell you what, if we, and no matter what this country does in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation, that's where the world is heading, and that's what's going to hit us, and that is why adaptation is really, really needs to be addressed right now. Yes, mitigation, but any suggestion that adaptation is somehow some second cousin here that sits in the back room, forget it, because that's what will hit us.
Playing to the audience a tiny bit, I suppose.
Well,
I agree. So just to try to create
someone somewhere
effective controversy here, I don't think it's less or more important. I think it's quite different, and I think the approach needs to be an integrated approach. So I think one can equally argue that emissions is important for different reasons. I don't think I disagree with the concept, but I think what we don't need to have happen is that we pit things against, we're all part of the solution set trying to solve the same problem. We don't need to have a conversation, I don't think, about which one is better or more important. We just need an approach that represents each of them appropriately, and then we do it together.
Well, there will need to be trade-offs. There will need to be costs and trade-offs, and some hard decisions will have to be made. We can balance it in kumbaya land and say, that's fine, but somewhere the rubber hits the road and somebody's community is getting wiped out, and you hear the politicians start to run then. So I actually really believe that, yes, we've got to achieve those mitigation targets, but that protecting our environment, our communities, is going to be right up there politically.
I just want to add that I'm totally with, it's just action stations, and it has been action, it needed to be action stations for a long time, but it's critically action stations now. There is no more waiting around for another report, or and I'm with you, because it is, it's kind of freaks you out. But anyway, you have to put those energies into how you draw more people together to understand what needs to be done now. So I'm just so thankful that we've had this opportunity. Shameless plug to Deep South for giving us this opportunity to do this kind of work, and that we did way more than what we were funded for. But because our teams and our kaumātua and our whānau and our hapu between the Oho, Waikawa and towards Otaki, we just went hard out on visualising the adaptations that were required, that an iwi and hapu group could see themselves within, and it was real, and it was all based on real data. It was based on real solutions. So if our landscape architects, who can sometimes be a bit fanciful, but and that's lovely, but it's like, make it a real project. So intergenerational housing that adapted to water, or how was this whānau group going to adapt to be more water and no more farming in these areas, no more dairy farming in the areas on our coastal areas, and our whānau to be able to see categorically, shit, we have to change, and we've got to change now. So we're going to be planting shootloads of harakeke shortly this winter, because it's part of our adaptation strategy, it's part of our transition action planning, part of finding other economies, returning to economies that we used to know really well. Our people were famous for feeding Wellington, and harakeke was a source of resource. So it's returning all those things based on that knowledge of place that is past, present, future happening together. But my message to this crew, and it comes from our team as well, and from the support we have from our kaumātua, is that it's just now, action now, no more mucking around, just keep, every year there's more and more stuff happening, so that in 20 years we have a buffer that's actually going to assist. We have wetlands going, we have dune lake systems happening, we have trying to fix up, poor systems full of hornwort. There's always some other problem when you try and fix up something, there's something else. But I just constantly finding new ways, and our team constantly finding new ways of doing the stuff right now.
Yeah, I agree too.
So I'm just going to come back to Janet, who's been waiting very patiently, and then we'll come down to you, Rob.
Get a hand up. Got a hand up.
I did. I just wanted to pick up on another point to do with law and being fit for purpose. So while I applaud the climate change bill and the contents of that, it's not enough. We have numerous pieces of legislation in this country and policies that are continuing business as usual. So every piece of critical legislation, like the Resource Management Act, like the Public Works Act, like the decision-making frameworks that NZTA uses to invest in new roads, all of these things need to be reviewed with a climate adaptation framing to say, how can we rethink all of these decisions to achieve the kinds of future that we need to, because otherwise we're going to be continuing down this predetermined pathway which is leading to worse and worse situations.
Yep, good one.
Rob, sorry to cut you off.
I was just going to briefly mention that, I see them as two sides of a coin, adaptation and mitigation. And so in the coastal area, what we do with mitigation is not going to affect us in the near term. We've already committed to 0.5 to 1 metre of sea level rise, so we have to adapt. But in the long run, as Kathy said this morning, in terms of suffering, do we want to be subject to 1 metre sea level rise or 3 or 4 metres down the track if we don't mitigate?
Well, we definitely don't want 3, because we know what that looks like.
I know, so we have to mitigate.
There goes the ancestral coastline. Yeah.
So we have to mitigate emissions.
So this is meant in playful spirit, not controversial and trying to duke it out here. I think there's some very real impacts for people on the mitigation side happening right now, because things like air quality, price of fuels are very here and now for people. So that's why, again, I think this isn't like a jousting of which is better, but there are some very here and now impacts of mitigation that we would do well to prepare for now, because if we have a price trajectory, or if we have an understanding of what those impacts will be without action for urban air quality, for instance, we could start moving in the right direction there too.
Yeah.
So that's a challenging one, right? the here and now impacts make it obvious for people when they can see effects in their community. But then there's the psychological phenomenon of discounting, where the things that are happening in the future you don't give as much weight to. And a lot of the adaptation work would be preparing for those things that are in the future. So how can the research community help address that? What can the research community look at or provide that helps people better understand what's coming and how to adapt?
Well, I think the research community has made a contribution. Judy Lawrence is somewhere in here and has done a lot of quality research on adaptive pathways, where you take that long view and you look at the various short-term, medium-term options available to you. You don't lock yourself into a major investment for 40 years down the track, but look at how you can manage that over time and look at what other things can come into play over that time as well. So I think the research community is contributing in providing that kind of discourse, which then feeds into community discussions around, well, what is it that we do need to do here? And you've just been giving some great examples around, planting of flax and all sorts of other things that are adaptive pathways that are not going to solve everything for 40 years' time, but they are certainly creating adaptation risk reduction responses now. So that's come out of the natural instinctive community, going back to what worked well, why shouldn't it work well in the future, but also the science research coming through and providing us with that kind of pathway. I think that's really useful contribution. So that's just one thought I have on that.
And to add to that, I think in the research in the last 5 years, moving away from a top-down approach where we have the scenario, we work out the impacts, and then we decide how that's affecting people, but more a bottom-up approach. What are the thresholds that you are concerned about, where your objectives or whatever you're trying to do may not be met? So the adaptive pathways ask those questions, and then if you're going to address it with a short-term action like a seawall, introducing the concept of shelf life. So if your seawall only going to have a shelf life of 10 years or 15, is it worth investing?
Yeah.
Or is it better to look at long shelf life options? So I think this bottom up, and that creates a conversation in terms of engagement about what they see are the thresholds, when are things going to go awry, when is it going to affect us, rather than this top-down approach.
Yeah, that's a really great segue. So I'm going to shamelessly plug my own research because I'm here. So in terms of bottom-up engagement, working with communities, I'm looking with a bunch of other youth to set up a community science project within New Zealand, a sort of a national project around how communities can participate using science in these adaptation conversations. And that science here I'm using it as a really broad term, so whatever science means to that community. And so how can we design and set up ways for citizens to participate in the adaptation process, but using science? So if there are any researchers here that want to talk to us about that, please come and see me afterwards. So yeah, that I think sounds great.
I'm just shameless hustling here for artists and designers. You need them with the scientists.
Yes, I'm on the board for Track Zero, so
get those visual systems happening in there because it makes it go faster.
Yeah.
I'm just married to an academic, so I don't think I have any license to say anything. I mean, council does research, right? So I've already plugged that quite a bit, and we need to do more, and it's really groundbreaking. But I can pass the mic.
Sure, Janet.
I think I'll take the big picture here. I think research, for me, needs to grapple with this idea of both intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. So how can we take this adaptation journey and bring communities with us and organisations and iwi and stakeholders at every level in a way that creates a national conversation and a national language that incorporates really fundamental principles about equity and drives that into all the decisions we make, so that when we are working at the micro level and the macro level, and in the short term and the long term, those fundamental principles around equity and justice and fairness are carried through in everything that we do. There are huge research questions in there, but I'm just posing that as being, I think, the biggest issue that we've got to grapple with.
I've got an additional question for you as well, Huhana, as well as what sort of research do you think is particularly needed? From your perspective as an artist as well as a researcher, and you've mentioned a couple of times, needing the visual element, what do you think are the best ways to communicate, or what are the ways that you have seen work in terms of communicating and visualising those messages?
Well, we're in our research, so with the two Phase 1, Phase 2 Climate Change Deep South National Science Challenge, we used exhibitions as a research method. So we pulled together our methodologies of hikoi, whakapapa and kōrero tuku iho and turned them into exhibitions. So use those as thematics in exhibitions. Now, these exhibitions could either happen, we did geological time, which was that big long frame of time, and the effects of climatic changes over 400,000 years. We did a maramataka, we did another exhibition at Victoria University around the Māori concept of time. And these are all on the website, these reports are all on the Deep South website. And then we did a major kind of Phase 1 adaptation strategies exhibition in a dairy shed on our tribe's farm in Kuku in Hoda Phenoix, which was basically showing our people, here's what we've got, here's what it is now, and here's what it looks at 3 metres, and there goes the coastline, basically. Well, basically it becomes unarable for farming. It's constantly, the surface and subsurface water is very close, or we're constantly flooded. And then we did, oh gosh, let me just try and remember. We do show people that kind of thing. We did all the master's students at Victoria University who provided the real projects, like adapting to water, harakeke industry for the fine fabric industry. We had artists responding with, famous photographers from New Zealand showing work. We had landscape architects doing drawings, all sorts of things. Bringing all this knowledge together based on the complex data to show our people, our Māori people, that they could understand this complexity in a way that they got through huge maps, huge photographs, beautifully designed data that showed people the problems that we had. But then it also showed the what are the thresholds, what are the triggers, and then what are solutions. So everything was very transformative and solutions orientated, wrapped into an exhibition. We should have had more people there because it was fabulous. It's a really, really good way of showing people difficult information in a way that they could get it quickly. That's now morphed into that. That was then shown at the Dallas Art Museum, so that was in 2017. And then currently what our team are working on, we're now working with international artists who are all engaged in the art, ecology, climate change space, and we're taking it to the globe now. So this is what Aotearoa is doing in various places, this is what Tunisia is doing, this is what Indigenous Australia is doing, so that more and more people actually see that there are real pathways and real solutions that can be implemented. And then meanwhile, back in Kuku, we're doing the action on the ground. So I think if you get my drift, we might show people lots of things, but we do a lot of stuff on the ground at the same time.
I'm conscious of the time, and we've probably only got a few more minutes. Some people have flights to catch and others have drinks to drink. So 5 minutes, is that? Yeah? Okay. So John, I did want to return to you to ask you about Auckland in particular. So you've talked a bit about some of the research that the council's already done and the fact that there is much more research underway. Can you elaborate for us on what's underway in terms of what you currently know that you don't know?
Good question. I'm less qualified than many in this room to answer that question because some of them actually are the researchers doing that work. So I'd recommend you find them and talk to them. My quick high-level view, though, is I won't be able to rattle off all 6 reports, but I did kind of give an overview of some of the impacts to marine freshwater ecosystems, species, heat, a range of other social and environmental impacts. But there are two that are remaining that maybe you could just keep your eyes open for, and both are much more localized look at what sea level rise and flooding will look like at a less macro scale. So we've already got information in there saying things like 100, correct me if I'm wrong, those who know, something like 147,000 buildings are potentially at risk from flooding in Auckland. It's about 23% of all buildings over 60 square meters, I think. Is that just kind of get a yeah from somebody like Nancy? Yeah, it's roughly right. She'll put some caveats on that. So we have a pretty good idea of what that looks like, and that scares the pants off of people who make decisions or who need to change business as usual. But it's such an important set of information. So we'll find just more details there. We'll see more details about what specific communities and different compartments along the coast are going to see for sea level rise. We'll see things like what the localized flooding impacts will be. So keep your eyes open for those two reports in the coming couple of months. And then I think, from at least my perspective, we were just thrilled to actually engage our research team to pump this stuff out. There's a whole set of new things that I've kind of alluded to that we can dig into, including impacts for Māori, including things around the economy, supply chain. It's sort of the sky's the limit. But it really, I'd encourage you to look at Knowledge Auckland to see those first 6 reports, a summary report, that's the 7th one, and those last 2 are coming out sometime this year.
Rather than finishing off with a question, maybe we'll just quickly run down the line, and if anyone has anything they'd like to say by way of brief closing statement, so that here's your chance to get across the one most important thing that you haven't said yet. Anyone want to put their hand up to go first before I cruelly pick someone?
Oh, sure. I'll just make something up, right? So, look, I mean, this is a group of people who are engaged in this space. You're either academics or stakeholders or policymakers or whatever. So I think we occasionally need to come together like this, keep the energy high at the end of the day, before drinks, all that, and just remember that let's be bold in this space. I mean, whether it's adaptation, mitigation, or both, really our future communities who are here now, who will be here, depend on people like us to really put our necks on the line and really go gutsy. And I think I'll say that as a bureaucrat, so hold me accountable. If we don't come up with like the best local climate action plan that you've ever seen, come find us and tell us why it's not great. Do that during the consultation period, which is July and August. Have your say. So I think all of us in our respective positions really need to think, the sky's the limit here. We don't have a lot of time to lose kind of making sure, oh, you're going to lead, am I going to lead? We all need to lead in this space.
The biggest thing that we find, I mean, the work that we've done over the years requires an incredible amount of effort, but it also requires an incredible amount of resource. Now, oftentimes we've done our Deep South projects with a certain amount of money, and we've kind of trebled or quadrupled the effort. So my kind of key thing is resourcing, serious resourcing to get some serious things happening on the ground. I think if we're talking governments consolidating their efforts and their, I would just say please more funding, more support for projects that are, that work. Would be really, really helpful, because I think there's so much time goes into the funding, the multiple funding applications to actually do the action. You might do the research and have all the research questions and find all the findings, but the implementation is where it needs exceptional resourcing. Make it happen.
Make it happen. Janet.
I too think resourcing is really important, but I think there's a huge goodwill amongst agencies and amongst businesses to start collaborating on this topic. And I've had so many approaches today from people completely outside the square, from who I would usually do research with, including a bank, saying, we'd really like to do research with you guys because we think there's some really important questions here. And I think there are possibilities to create quite new consortiums for research activity because this is a new topic. And I have to go and catch a plane, so I'm going to go right now. Sorry.
Okay, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So Janet's done her mic drop. Lisa.
I don't want to leave it on a bad note, but I would say there is a significant amount of what we're calling, or psychologists are calling, climate grief within young people at the moment. And there is a certain amount of powerlessness and worry and concern, and the words climate crisis, it's the new sustainability, the new resilience, that's what we're facing. And just think about that when you're doing your work, please. But yeah, as I said before, please engage with young people who are already in this space, and a lot of them are doing that at university or at home in their communities, and include them. And if a young group of volunteers can get a new climate law into the country, imagine what they can do to your projects.
Rob.
So we've spent a bit of time talking about some of the systemic issues with our current statutory framework, for instance. But I think as researchers and certainly being involved in the MFE guidance, there are creative ways we can work around the current situation for the meantime, but also looking at creative solutions in the non-statutory space was something that we able to do with the Hawke's Bay community. So the engagement was in the non-statutory space, but of course there are issues once you start to implement it and re-enter the statutory space. So I think some of those research ideas can be developed, but they can also inform the change to the system. So I think researchers have a really good role there in terms of coming up with innovative ways that take into account the changing risk.
Difficult one. Urgency, action, agree with all of those things. Taking that long view, having the legislative frameworks in place. Funding is going to be fundamental, so that's got to be backed, and that always is that challenge between the short and long-term prioritisation of funding with short-term election cycles, notwithstanding a zero carbon bill that will give us that long view. Ultimately, it's still governments that make those decisions and how well they will fund what needs to be done. So I guess my plea is that there's a focus for risk reduction continually driven. Otherwise, we're going to be in a deep one.
Focus and funding. Thank you, everyone. How about a round of applause for our panellists?